Howdy. So this is the flip that I sort of promised I'd make so that you could work on your essays over the next week or so over Easter, because I'm not going to see you for a little while. Just make this big for you to look at. So just keep in mind the essay question, which is, how does Steinbeck use literary techniques to convey the idea that our quality of life is enhanced if we have hope for a better future and a companion to share it with? So we'll talk about George first, or Lieutenant Dan. His last name is Milton, which I only just realised the other day actually. So there are three techniques you can discuss with George. First of all, his characterization. So describe George. How does Steinbeck introduce us to this character? For example, small and quick with restless eyes. And then talk about his companionship with Lenny. So his role in that friendship, how George benefits from his friendship with Lenny, how is their friendship painted as unusual and rare, because keep in mind it was most people travelled alone in those times. George did say at the beginning, if I was alone I could live so easy, but we know that he doesn't really mean that, because later on he says, I do want you with me, Lenny. I would also look at the conversation that George has with Slim, because there's lots of good quotes and evidence that you could use there as well. And you can also mention the foreshadowing of the name of the town, Soledad, which means solitude in Spanish, and that foreshadows that George will end up alone. And lastly, just think about how does their companionship advantage him over the other characters, and how does this highlight what Steinbeck is ultimately trying to say about the importance of companionship. In regards to hope for a better future, how does the dream, I've left out a word there, how does the dream enhance Lenny's life in the short time at the ranch? So describe George's dream for starters. So it's the American dream. Their dream to own their own farm gives George hope. His motivation is different to Lenny's, though. He wants to be independent. He doesn't want to worry about getting canned. And this is symbolised through his obsession with solitaire. It's a game that is played alone. He wants to be independent. He doesn't want to play a card game with someone else. He likes to play on his own. Candy says, I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog. So this is foreshadowing. It foreshadows that George, what he will eventually do to Lenny, marking the end of their companionship and their dream. However, it also proves George's love for Lenny. It was an act of love. So what is Steinbeck ultimately trying to say about dreams through George, and how does it advantage him over the other characters in the story? Here are some quotes that you could use. There's heaps in the book, but here are some of, the ones I think are pretty interesting. George said wonderingly, suppose there was a carnival or a circus come to town, or a ball game, or any damn thing, we'd just go to her, George said. We wouldn't ask nobody if we could, just say, we'll go to her, and we would. Just milk the cow and sling some grain to the chickens and go to her. So think about, what does this quote say about George's desire to have this farm? What's his true motivation? This quote kind of reveals that. This is when they realised that the dream could be a possibility because of Candy's savings. As they fell into a silence, they looked at one another amazed. This thing they had never really believed in was coming true. George said reverently, Jesus Christ, I bet we could swing her. His eyes were full of wonder. I bet we could swing her, he replied softly. So, his eyes being full of wonder. Think about how this is enhancing his life. He's got hope, that idea of wonder and having excitement for the future. So now we'll talk about Lenny. So first job in this paragraph, talk about the characterization of Lenny. How is he described? How does Steinbeck introduce us to this character? And you can talk about the symbolism of the bear. There's a few dot points you can refer to there. We know that he's got a mental disability of some kind. And then talk about companionship for Lenny. So how does his friendship with George benefit him? How does Lenny's friendship with George advantage him over other characters? And how does this highlight what Steinbeck is ultimately trying to say about the importance of companionship? You know, sometimes we need people to look out for us. I thought this was an interesting quote. This isn't necessarily for your essay, but in the first chapter, when after George has a real go at Lenny, you know, I'd be better off alone without you, and then George feels sorry that he said that, and he starts to backtrack and tries to you know, basically say sorry in his way. And in the book it says Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. So in some ways, Lenny knows how to manipulate George as well. He's not as dumb as what you might think. He says, I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you. So it's a good little reflection of their friendship. So as far as hope for a better future, describe Lenny's dream and his motivation. Lenny's joy is derived from hearing George tell him how it's going to be one day when they own their own farm. Lenny wants George to tell him over and over about the dream like it's some sort of magical fairy tale rather than a reality. He says, tell me how it's going to be, George. It's like a nighttime story. So it's more of this magical thing, you know. I think Lenny actually just gets the joy out of hearing about it. He doesn't necessarily feel driven to actually achieve it. So Lenny's killing of the small animals foreshadows the terrible ending with Curly's wife. This ends the dream for everyone. With the loss of the dream, both George and Candy are devastated. What is Steinbeck ultimately trying to say about dreams through Lenny? That should be Lenny, sorry. And how does it advantage him over other characters? My mum's just trying to call me. Go away, Mum. Okay, so this is the dream for Lenny, and live off the fat of the land and have rabbits. It's all about the rabbits. Okay, let's talk about Candy. So first job, once again, talk about the characterization, describe Candy, how does Steinbeck introduce this character, what is his disability, and how does Candy's dog symbolize Candy himself. So in regards to hope for a better future and companionship, describe Candy's companionship with his dog and how this symbolizes the lifelong relationship between George and Lenny. How does this foreshadow George's final act of love for Lenny? How does Candy change when he takes on the American dream with George and Lenny? Think about what he angrily says to Curly's wife in Crook's room. When Lenny dies and Candy loses the dream, consider how this devastates him. And it's a very sad scene at the end of the book. I usually feel a bit upset when I read that bit. And what is Steinbeck ultimately saying about the importance of dreams and companionship through Candy? So Candy is at the end of his life, but when he takes on that dream with Lenny and George, he becomes full of hope and joy for that to happen. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. So Candy said that. And this is what he angrily says to Curly's wife. He says, and we got friends, that's what we got. So that's like this major prize that he's got to claim over Curly's wife. Here's a nice little quote too. Old Candy turned slowly over. His eyes were wide open. He watched George carefully. Suppose I went in with you guys. So this is when Candy overhears George and Lenny talking about their dream of owning the farm. His dog has just died. He's desperately depressed and he's lying on his bed and he hears these two men talking about this dream to own this farm. And the book says that he slowly turned over. His eyes were wide open, which indicates hope, indicates wonder. And then it says he watched George carefully, and then later on in that little section he wants to be a part of it. Now let's talk about Curly's wife. So you're talking about Curly's wife as a contrast to the other ones. So she highlights the consequences of loneliness and unfulfilled plans. So just seeing all my spelling errors, sorry. So first of all, once again, the characterization of her. How is she described? Who is she? Keep in mind that the fact that she doesn't have a name is deliberate on Steinbeck's part. It symbolizes her loneliness, her disempowerment. She doesn't even have an identity. So describe her dream and include a quote about her loss of it. What evidence is there of her loneliness, and how does this disadvantage her as a character? You could look at some foreshadowing of the seduction of Lenny. It's evident through what George says about her. So find a quote of him calling her jailbait or rat trap. And what is Steinbeck ultimately saying about how having no one and losing your dream could affect you? Think about her tragic end. So some quotes. This is what the other men said about her. One of them said, "Well, I think Curly's married a tart." "Jesus, what a tramp. Well, ain't she a Lulu?" And this is what George says to Lenny. He says, "Don't you even take a look at that bitch. I don't care what she says and what she does. I seen 'em poisoned before, but I never seen a piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be." And this one's quite good. George said, "She's gonna make a mess. There's gonna be a bad mess about her. She's a jailbait all set on the trigger." So these things that George said to Lenny, this is foreshadowing. Like, there really was a bad mess about her. He was completely right about her. There's something she says to the fella. She says, "I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely." So another character who's stricken by loneliness. She says, "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. I think I don't like to talk to someone every once in a while. Think I like to stick in that house all of the time." This is her dream. She says, "I tell ya, I could have went with the shows. Not just one neither. And a guy told me he could put me in the pictures." She says, "I could have made something of myself," she said darkly. So she wanted to be an actress in the movies. This is not really totally relevant to your essay, but every time Curly's wife turns up and she leaves a place, either physically or because she's died, the horses snort or stamp, and you hear the rattling of halter chains. So it's almost like that instinctual, like even the horses, even the animals know that, have an instinct about this character, about there's going to be a mess about her. And in your conclusion, just think of the, you're saying how authors are deliberate with the techniques they use to communicate ideas and perspectives, and really think about what Steinbeck, why he wrote this novel. What's he trying to convey about friendships and dreams and the importance of those things. And I've just got an example paragraph on crooks. So the reason crooks isn't a part of your essay is because, well, you probably could have done crooks. He could easily fit in. But there's not as much literary techniques. It's mainly characterization, and even the symbolism that I've put an example of here, it's a bit reaching, to be honest. I don't know if it's actually true that Steinbeck, made that a symbol, but I just put it in there for the sake of this. There's no foreshadowing for crooks either. So in contrast to George and Lenny's envied relationship, Steinbeck highlights the result of an isolated, aimless life through the characterization of crooks. That's in red because it's the topic sentence, and in green I've put the literary techniques, and in purple is the evidence, the quotes. The proud and aloof black stable hand is excluded from the other men. Like most of the characters in the novel, he admits that he is extremely lonely, evident when he whines, "A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody." What Crooks wants is a sense of belonging, to be able to enter the bunkhouse or to play cards with the other men. Envious of George and Lenny's relationship, he is cruel to Lenny and suggests that George might not return. This behaviour exhibits the corrosive effects that loneliness can have on a person. His crooked back is a symbol of how his loneliness has crippled him. When he is, that's the one, I'm not actually sure if that's true, but it sounds good, so whatever. When he is visited by Lenny and Candy, Steinbeck writes that it was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger, showing that Crooks is delighted with the unexpected company. Crooks is even won over by Lenny's dream. Despite his skepticism, he says, if you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just his keep, why I'd come and lend a hand. However, Curly's wife enters and reminds him to keep his place, and in response, he reduces himself to nothing and retracts on his offer to help on the farm. This demonstrates how Crooks's loneliness and hopelessness have eroded his well-being despite the pleasure and hope he felt for a fleeting moment in his conversation with Lenny and Candy. So I hope this flip helps you to write your essay. And you can obviously pause this video, have a closer look at the example paragraph. Let me know, email me, whatever, if you've got any other questions. And I'll see you on next week on Thursday. All right, happy Easter. Bye.